Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special symposium from Signum University. This is a rather unusual symposium. It's not one of our usual straight-up literary or linguistics topics. So today we are going to discuss mental health in the academy, how issues of mental health and mental illness affect students and faculty, and sort of the academic structure, what we can do about it, those sorts of things. So we welcome your questions throughout this time. There is a questions box where you can type your questions to us, and we will try to integrate those as the event proceeds. Shortly, I will introduce you to our panelists, but first, I just want to invite you to check out what's going on right now at Signum. Most exciting thing at the moment is our annual fall fundraiser. So Sparrow has just sent you a link. We really ask if you are willing to maybe consider going there and giving a donation so that Signum can continue to offer free programming like this, and that the graduate school part of the university can continue to grow and offer its excellent programming. All right. And you can also check out our events page to see what other exciting things are going on during the fall fundraiser and other times. There are exciting regional gatherings going on all over the country and a couple abroad as well. So do check those out. I would like to introduce our panelists today, and I think each might say a little something about why they're here today, sort of their interest in this subject and so forth, and then we will get into our discussion. So I'll start with Sparrow Alden, who is a preceptor and student advisor here at Signum University. She bravely manages our online learning platform, Google Classroom, and the Community Hearth. And she has also represented the Signum staff on the board. Now, Sparrow, you have some other credentials and interests too, maybe more directly related to today's topic.
I do as well. In addition to having been a graduate student and now an advisor for graduate students and seeing the stressors and the change that come over all of us as we cope with really intense academics, in the other part of my life, I am a pastor, and I have a special ministry. We're near Dartmouth College and my congregation, and so I have a special ministry with, of course, the high school youth in my congregation and on Dartmouth campus. So to witness and walk with some of these people who are just finding the pressure more than they expected and need help over the hurdles. Thank you for inviting me. This is great.
Thanks for being here, Sparrow. And Karl Pearson has been on our faculty in the past at Signum University. He has a doctorate in English from the University of British Columbia and a master's degree in English from the University of Regina. His area of scholarly interest is pre-modern literature with reference to the ways it intersects with theological, philosophical, and sapiential traditions, wisdom literature. Karl, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I have those degrees, and I'm currently teaching at a small college in the wilderness of Ontario, Our Lady Seat of Wisdom College. And my credentials for being here are, well, I mean, I have the doctorate, I've done the academic thing, but since childhood I have had obsessive compulsive disorder, which later in my life sort of blossomed into depression as well. So I have the fact of having experienced all this and having had to learn to work with it alongside getting degrees and getting a job. So yes, I can't ignore these matters because they are a part of my life. So that's why I'm here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. And we look forward to maybe hearing more of your story as we go on. And Karen Pearson, Karl's sister, is a registered nurse, registered psychiatric nurse. She has been that for the last 10 years. She works in several areas in the psychiatric department at the Regina General Hospital in Saskatchewan. She works with both inpatients and outpatients requiring treatment for mental illnesses. She also works in the electroconvulsive therapy department and the injection clinic. She also loves to paint and draw and read and travel. And thank you very much for being here with us today, Karen.
You're welcome. Yeah, so I think that kind of sums up why I'm here. I have been working there for it's almost 10 years. And because I'm Karl's sister, we have a family history of mental illness. So basically, when you combine that with my experience as a psychiatric nurse, I've seen all sorts of different types of mental illnesses, people coming from different backgrounds, lots and lots of people who are students, university students, and some even in high school that do struggle with mental illnesses of various kinds. So yeah, hopefully I can contribute.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really glad that we could have someone from the mental health care profession join us. And I just do want to clarify that. So we have one mental health professional and 3 English professors with varying degrees of experience and exposure to this topic. So, so we want to talk about what problems people with mental health difficulties might face in the academy, how severe this problem might be, and so forth. And the experience of mental illness is increasingly more common among students and faculty at institutes of higher education. I do have some statistics I can read out to sort of give the context, and then anyone can share stories, concerns, thoughts. There's a 2014 report by UC Berkeley that found that from 43 to 46% of graduate students, specifically in the biosciences, were depressed. More generally speaking, about 47% of PhD students reach the threshold considered depressed, and master's students, while better off than PhD students, still score as depressed about 37% of the time, which is 6% higher than the general population. Now, I tried to find specific statistics about faculty members, and I think it's quite telling that I already couldn't find specific stats about faculty, right? So that tells you something right there already, that this area hasn't been studied quite as much. But it does seem that especially contingent faculty have higher rates of reported mental health issues than the general population, and that there are certain populations who might be more at risk than others. People who are in an ethnic minority, more elderly faculty, women seem to score a little bit higher, and especially, again, all of those who are in a non-tenured track or a contingent situation. But this is not at all exclusive. There are other populations as well. So any of the 3 of you have thoughts on, do those statistics sound ridiculous? You know, why might this be the case? Let's just start brainstorming here. Sparrow, I think you're muted on your end.
There, thank you so much. The dogs were making a great noise, so there we go. Just to start at the physical level, and I wonder, Karen, if you might be able to, with your expertise, tell me if my field observations make sense. But it seems to me that when someone's in such a focused, goal-centered environment as academia, that we might forget body-mind wholeness, that going for a hike and calling your family and having a leisurely long bath, there might not even be a bathtub if you're at a bricks and mortar school, that the things that keep us robust and balanced are neglected, and that sometimes folks are using like caffeine to stay awake to meet that goal, the goal that they love. And then maybe using alcohol so when it's time to sleep, instead of responding to their body's natural needs. That's just something I've observed. Karen, how does that sound to you?
No, I 100% agree with that. It's true. Most of the coping techniques that the psychiatrists, mental health professionals will recommend are things that require you to step back and take time for yourself. And it's true that when you're studying any course, really, there's very, very little time for that. And what happens is the person ends up going into that sort of fight or flight mode, and they sort of stay in that mode, and there's not really there's not necessarily an end to that in sight. So I think that that can get you worked up to the point where you're just sustaining that fight and flight mode for too long. So it can decrease your immune system. It obviously isn't good for depression because although a certain amount of stress is healthy, if you have a sustained amount of stress for long periods of time, that can definitely affect the mental health. And like you say, going for a long walk, taking a bath, making a phone call, there's just not time for that. And then what happens is the thing that you have so much passion about becomes a chore as opposed to something that you're actually passionate about. So it's a definite rut that people get into. So I agree with that.
Does it sound right? And I'm opening to everyone. It seems to me that if you've got a familial or a personal history vulnerability to some kind of mental illness, that all of us in that stressful forgetting to take care of ourselves situation are put at risk. But you've got more than a double risk if you've got that diathesis, the vulnerability to say depression in a family or bipolar disorder or even a dissociative disorder from past stressors. Does that sound right?
No, that's exactly right. If someone is predisposed to a mental illness, then any amount of stress can exacerbate that. So whereas a person might function relatively normally from day to day, if they're put in that sort of crisis situation or stress mode or sustained fight or flight response, then definitely it can bring out these mental health concerns. And yeah, I don't think that you're out of line there. And I mean, some forms of depression can be very, very much related to a situation. So someone might have a depression related to the situation, and if the situation is actually taken away, then they can actually go back to not meeting that criteria anymore. So there's different types. Some people will have it regardless throughout their life, but some people, if that specific situation is taken away, then the symptoms start to disappear too. So
yeah. Karl, I want to hear from you on this question, and then I'm going to bring in a comment that we got from an attendee. Karl, what do you think about the statistics and the bleak picture that they paint?
Well, I particularly noticed the statistics about the statistics you mentioned about graduate students, and also the ones you didn't have on faculty and full-time academics. With regard to the graduate students, I really think we need to get to a place where we're thinking about dealing with mental health in terms of what degrees one is doing, because I think in certain places we're getting good at caring for undergrads. In certain places there's things in place, but I've encountered situations where they have a plan in place for undergrads, but graduate students there's no particular plan. And I think well, this is particularly frightening because I think in graduate school, in the MA, but perhaps even more in the PhD, I mean, we're basically in some ways pitting ourselves against ourselves. Like we're going out to research something absolutely new that no one else has done, and so we're spending a lot of time alone, which sort of leaves us alone with ourselves for quite a while. So when there's a predisposition to things like depression, that sort of aloneness and fighting against yourself sometimes can become despair.
Right.
And so I think we need to talk about, how do we deal with this unique situation we're putting someone in where they're going and sort of fighting with themselves all day. And the other thing I wanted to say about faculty, I mean, part of the problem is, as you mentioned, just the job market. Being on the academic job market puts people in extremely stressful, competitive, and really punishing situations. So you're very rarely going, well, I mean, yeah, you're competing with 250 other people who have got their degrees and who are all very smart. And, you're sort of just throwing something out there that you're likely going to get a form letter that says, no, we don't want to, or, we appreciate your interest, but we don't want to hire you. And I mean, getting that kind of feedback over and over again on one's work is, setting someone up to experience various kinds of mental illness, particularly if one is predisposed that way. So yeah, so that's, I think, all I have to say about those statistics.
Right.
Actually, I do have one other thing. I'm not surprised by the fact that there's difficulty finding information on full-time academics, because this is still kind of a difficult thing to talk about personally, but also a lot of academics are afraid to talk about it because they're afraid of what it implies for their jobs. So yeah.
Yep. And we'll get into that shortly. I have lots of stories and details about that. And Sharon Hoff has a comment that she sent in about that. She said, it can be surmised that faculty were once students, and achieving a position in academic circles is not a magic solution to depression. You're exactly right, Sharon. And so here's something that I think I observed as I was reading through articles and looking at things today. It seems that the pressure becomes more intense in each phase of becoming an academic, and at the same time, the available resources go down. So you said, Karl, I think you're right, that resources for undergraduates have greatly, greatly improved. Statistics and personal observation at my own home institution, Baylor University, suggests that's true. Yeah, I realized I forgot to introduce myself. Serena Higgins, currently getting a PhD at Baylor University. And I have statistics available from 2012 from Baylor. And then I recently heard a presentation, but unfortunately don't have the data. But for instance, from 2005 to 2011, the number of students using the counseling services went from 600 to almost 1,200. Wow. So it almost doubled. And then I believe the number has perhaps more than doubled again since 2012. And according to this 2012 study, 14% of college students have been treated for depression before entering college. But then 27% of 18 to 24-year-olds have a diagnosable mental illness. And then, as we heard a minute ago, 47% of PhD students. So what happens is that the pressure on one gets greater and greater and greater. So the pressure right now, in a PhD program is incredible. Like, the workload is intense, but that's often true. But also, as you mentioned, the competitiveness factor and the high stakes on small things is pretty intense. And then if you go into the job market phase, that's even more intense. And then from what I hear, the tenure track, the first 5 years before gaining tenure, can be even more pressure on an even heavier workload. So yeah, Sharon, you're right in that if 47% of PhD students have a mental health problem, then theoretically 47% of faculty do as well. I'm not sure it lines up though, because so few of us get full-time jobs, right? The job market is such an enormous part of that as well. So people who don't get the resources and aren't able to make it through their PhD program, or aren't able to make it through the job process, maybe a lot of people might be weeded out who have these issues and haven't had the resources. But I do also want to suggest a slightly more positive interpretation of these statistics too for a minute, which is more and more resources are becoming available, starting with the undergrads and working their way up. And I at least have observed a decrease of stigma, which means more and more people are being reported into the system, into the statistics. So more people are seeking help, more help is available for the people who need it, and more people are willing to go and seek it. So I don't think that the human race has suddenly become more mentally unstable than it's ever been. I think we have more terminology, more understanding, and more resources. What do we think of that interpretation?
Yeah,
Sparrow,
I think.
Karen, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think that people are becoming more vocal about it, and we still have a long way to go in terms of reducing stigma. But at the same time, I think you bring up a good point about saying that now that people maybe are feeling more comfortable to seek out help, then yes, the statistics would definitely look different. And now that people are maybe recognizing the symptoms, maybe otherwise they would just see it as a sign of weakness. Now they might look and say, hey, like I'm actually suffering from depression. They would be more likely to be in that category of people who are in the statistics of having depression. So I think that that's a huge, huge possibility. And yes, I do feel that that's a more positive take on it, because within those statistics are hopefully people that are getting help somehow. So yeah.
Right. Yeah.
May I tell you, Sorina, about an amazing presentation that I went to in August?
Yes, please.
Speaking of the stigma, Justice Brennan, who is a retired New Hampshire State Supreme Court justice, had a long career in law, and capstone was this long career on the bench, became a Supreme Court justice. When he retired, he went into charitable work and gave all kinds of time. Great guy. And then 2 years ago, he said, I am done with the stigma. And he has spent the last 2 years going to every single high school he can that will open the door to him to talk about his son's mental illness.
Wow.
Yeah. And he has been so brave about the story. The family was nearly torn apart. And this dignified senior statesman has said, mental illness is in my family. And I have not met a family that it hasn't touched. And he's saying, the stigma hurts people, let's talk. According to him, every time he talks to a bunch of teens and says, it is okay to ask for help. Here are the people, look at the people on stage with me, they can help you.
Right.
Every time he's talked to them, there have been young people just flocking up to him for hugs. And the principals are all, you're not supposed to hug them. And he says, as long as these kids need a hug so badly they'll come to a stranger, I will hug them.
Yeah.
And the inspiration to say, there is a stigma, there's no reason for it, let's crack it open, was inspiring and wonderful. I just wanted everyone to know this great guy is out there doing this.
That's great. Well, let's start from there on the issue of stigma and circle through what it is, why it is, how bad is it real, and then come back around again to, is it getting any better? Because as I prepared for this today and read story after story, it was very discouraging. There does seem to be a sense that people who are, we'll start with faculty and maybe work our way down this time. So faculty who are on the tenure track generally do not disclose a mental health concern until after they've been granted tenure. And there's one author, Karen Pryall, who has written a series of articles on this for Inside Higher Ed. I recommend all of them. But the end, her recommendation was, to my non-tenured colleagues with psychiatric disabilities, don't disclose, not yet. Let your counterparts with tenure handle this campaign for a while. So that's what she said after going through her own story. And she quoted people saying things like, we are the intellectual elites in our respective fields, or at least that's what the brochures say, and thus our brains cannot possibly have problems. Or, they hired you for your mind, one person told me. Why would you volunteer that there's something wrong with it? She was quick to point out, though, that she doesn't actually believe that a psychiatric disability necessarily means there's something wrong with your mind, but that's often the way it's taken. So you started out, Sparrow, by saying when we're academics, when we're scholars, like we often just live in our head and we forget to treat the body, which we need to do to stay healthy. But I mean, they hired our head, right? Yep. They really don't care what shape our body is in if we're academics. So if we disclose that there's something wrong with our head, we might not be hired on the tenure track. So Karl, do you want to speak to this issue first? And then we have some other bits we can throw in there.
Yeah, I do. And it is I mean, it's true there still is the stigma in the academic world, I would say, and there is certainly the feeling of stigma on the part of those who have mental illnesses. So there is a deep reluctance to talk about it, precisely because of what you say, because there's this idea that academics are kind of walking brains on sticks, and this is all we are, and if something is wrong with the brain, then why are we here? I mean, I would suggest that this is a problem that actually goes back to sort of an Enlightenment model of the academy. This idea that we all that really matters is what goes on inside our heads, defining our heads in a very particular way. I mean, we know a lot of things go on inside our heads, but narrowing it to this very sort of reason-oriented focus and treating the person as kind of a thinking machine. And I think we still kind of tend to do that and tend not to ask questions about that. Whereas with Sparrow, I'd say there are older, sort of more holistic models of what a person is and what it means to be part of an academy. That I think maybe if we did some research on, we could draw from those models to think about what is personhood within the academy, and could we think of it as something broader than just brains on sticks.
Sparrow, did you want to come in on that?
Whenever Karl speaks, I am reminded of one of those, of the clerk of Oxenford, who is not just an academician, but a cleric and a lover of books, who would just passionately in love with the study, but also have the religious zeal, which may still be pointed at the study, but it gives dimension to it, not just the brain, but the spirit. And just hearing your voice makes me think of the spiritual side of academia, and what you have to say reminds me that it has not always been just about getting grants and just about bringing income to the university. Sometimes, you got to go out in your garden and cross-pollinate the peas, right? And maybe do science the 400-year-old old-fashioned way, which gets your hands on and your sleeves rolled up and the good earth in your nose, maybe the scent of the good earth in your nose, excuse me.
Right.
That's what you made me think of. And wouldn't that be a beautiful model for maybe even starting with a small school to say, and I think there's some undergraduate institutions like this, saying, we want you to be getting your hands dirty, having experiences, having a semester at sea. So I think it's not lost. But as you say, Serena, the faculty are in a goldfish bowl where there's less care available than for undergrads. I think we're aware that these 18 to 22-year-olds have these great needs, but the 30-somethings, not so much. I'm going to disappear very briefly to get my electricity back. I need
All right, good luck. But it is true that, as one article I read puts it, people will often delay seeking medical help for a mental health problem because they're afraid of how their peers might react if they find out they have such a diagnosis. And Luke, who is attending here today, says, I have had tenure track colleagues tell me, don't give interviewers a reason to discriminate against you. Now, of course, they're not legally allowed to discriminate, and probably on an individual basis, people are very caring and so forth. But as you mentioned, Karl, the academic job market is so incredibly cutthroat. If there are 250 people interviewing for the one position, then disclosing a mental health problem might not be advantageous. And Diane shares the very true and sobering fact that sometimes the illness can shape our abilities, either temporarily or permanently. This is, of course, true for strictly physical health problems rather than mental health problems. I mean, I have a condition that sometimes results in pretty severe pain, and when I get the pain, I'm unable to think clearly, right? I just get this brain fog. So that is not specifically a mental health issue, but on those days, how am I supposed to write a clear argument, thinking through the pain? So yes, when I'm on the job market, I'll have to think long and hard and take advice about when do I disclose a medical condition in the process. Karen, do you have any thoughts here for us legally, medically, any of those aspects that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that there's that big message out there that you shouldn't be disclosing a mental illness to someone who could potentially hire you. And while I'd like to say, and this is like just my own take on it, what I'd like to say is that everyone should be able to be completely upfront about what they're suffering with and what they're struggling with. However, in the case of mental health, we are dealing with people who, whether they like to or not, some of them really do discriminate. They're not always objective, and because the stigma isn't completely gone, there are people out there who I believe would base a decision on your disclosure that you have a mental illness. So I think it's kind of a matter of taking each person on an individual basis and sort of just feeling them out. And it's not a bad thing to give out less information initially, and then maybe later on, once you form a bit of a rapport with the person, to disclose a bit more. But I do think that a person needs to be cautious about that, not because that's ideal, but because it's true that in the setting where there's very, very few spots available, people with depression are still considered a minority, even though they're not really a minority. There's so many people that still aren't out with their depression. People don't actually know that they have it. So I think it is a very individual basis, and it's very, very sad that in many cases people can be discriminated against or denied a certain position because of their disclosure. So yeah, it's really sad. So
yeah, and if you look at it from the universities or the institution's point of view, it's a hirer's market. And again, if I have 250 qualified candidates to choose from, I'm probably going to choose the one that I believe is going to be the most productive and, bring in the most research and grants and students and so forth to my institution. So you can understand how someone might be a little bit nervous if someone discloses something. Does anyone want to say more about faculty and stigma? And then I want to move it down to grad students, PhD students, MA students, and so forth. Karl?
Oh, sorry, repeat the question again.
Anything else you want to say about faculty and stigma before we switch to grad students?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the difficulties is really, in certain ways, the only way you can fight stigma is in some ways through disclosure. So the way you can fight stigma is if you know someone who has a mental illness that is different than the way you thought. So in certain ways, fighting stigma in the academy requires certain academics to say, okay, I have a mental illness and I'm an academic, this is what we need to talk about. But on the other hand, it's a dangerous thing to reveal. So it's hard to discern what to do there, because you are taking a risk in disclosing, but you are also fighting for something you believe in, which I guess is what has kind of led me to perhaps dangerously be open about it. But yeah.
Matthew gave a comment exactly on that right now. If there are legal protections to prevent people from discriminating against you to the point of not being allowed to ask you about it, then you shouldn't provide the information that they would not be allowed to ask voluntarily. So that seems absolutely true from a legal and practical point of view. We're going to move very soon into the solutions section, the what can we do, the support and help. But yes, that's a very good point, Matthew, and we balance that against what you just said, Karl, which is sharing. Someone's also mentioning that the issue of stigma is a problem in the technical world, perhaps a little more so than other fields. Technical folks are also hired for their brains. And there's stereotype of the engineer as someone who is logical and reason oriented. To disclose that your brain is broken is a bit risky. Luke is bringing up an excellent point that I saw in the research many times, Luke. When you combine the occurrence of poor mental health with imposturism, like the imposter syndrome, this leads to further isolated students because they do not see similar problems in the professionals in the field. Perfect transition, Luke, into talking about students and stigma, and then I want to move us into the solutions section. What risks are there? What sort of things have you seen in among grad students? Do you think there's more support and less stigma? There might even be, speaking generally, a generational difference. Although at Signum, of course, we have so many non-traditional students. Sparrow, go ahead.
I was going to say, but then you said generational, and I agree absolutely. I see a lot of medical school students, and so I would posit there's even a difference in disciplines. In med school, there's a long tradition that could even be called hazing. Between your degree granting years and your residency years, and it's unpleasant. And on the other hand, at the business school, people are getting married and getting dogs, and which is a different kind of pressure, but they're having a more holistic life, and they're actively networking and chumming up with each other instead of kind of a cutthroat way of being. I have no idea about painting with a broad brush. I do know that at my local university with a graduate program, the College of Arts and Sciences has good peer support networking, because these are cognitive neuroscientists and psychologists and great folks in the bio department who know and say, wait a minute, let's have, in our 20 free minutes a month, let's get together for pizza.
Right. Yep. And the research suggests that such peer groups are one of the most effective ways, to combat that sense of isolation and the continuing cycle of debilitating effects. Yeah. If any of our listeners here today want to share, a story or an observation about yourself or someone else, the situation of a grad student who is doing intense academic work while dealing with a mental health issue, we'd love to hear those. Comments from Karen or Karl about grad students and this situation?
I think, one of the things you have to wrestle with when you're in this situation as a graduate student is, do I tell my advisor? And I guess I could say in my MA, I was fairly transparent about what was going on. And actually that worked quite well for my MA because my supervisor was sympathetic. For my PhD, I was less straightforward, and I kind of wish I had been more openly communicative about that, because it explains various things that went wrong during my PhD. I got the PhD, but there were various times, that things were rocky in terms of mental health, and I wished I could have said to my supervisor, this is what's actually happening, and I didn't. It was my decision. I'm not saying this is a problem on my supervisor's part, but it was my decision to not say that, and I kind of wish I had. So this is something that everybody has to wrestle with, and in some cases it will depend on who you are and who your supervisor is. As do a lot of things when you're doing a PhD, because you're working sort of closely and intensely with one person. So this is this is one thing to think about, and I don't know if I have an easy solution for it. but yeah, I just thought I'd throw that out there as one of the things one faces in doing post upper level.
And I think that it partly depends on university culture and departmental culture, as well as your personality and that of your advisor. I know that where I am, I'm blessed that the culture is extremely supportive. I mean, my department brought in one of the counselors to talk about how we take care of our mental health as grad students. And he shared the statistics, but then he also gave very, very practical advice. And he basically begged us to come and get support. And then just recently, just this semester, the dean of the graduate school has put through a short-term leave policy that covers both physical and mental health issues. And we're just working out the details of how, how that applies to graduate instructors and so forth. But, I'm blessed with being in a very supportive community, and I hope that that continues to grow. And of course, when you have alternative educational formats like here at Signum, it can be easier to accommodate individual students' needs. Karen, any thoughts on that question as we then start to move into solutions and support?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you guys said. Like, I think it does vary from department to department, and there are some departments that are a lot more equipped to deal with struggles with mental illness. But as Karl said, there's always that question about, do you disclose it, don't you disclose it? And I do think that a lot of people are in the mindset that they're using their mental illness as a crutch, and that if they bring that up, they're just making excuses. Even though their mental illness is very legitimate, there's that perception that their advisor might think that you're just making excuses. So, but I do, I'm very glad to hear that Soren, your department is very supportive, and I think that it's very encouraging to have departments like that. And my hope is that those departments will become more and more and be able to influence the departments that are less aware. And I think that as slowly people become more knowledgeable and stronger, then I think that the people who feel in a safer position, if they feel comfortable, sometimes I think that they can influence for the good people who are in a maybe more vulnerable position where they don't feel as confident and comfortable in their department. So yeah.
And I have come across lots of helpful resources, and more top academics are publicly disclosing, and that's really helpful. So I'm actually going to share the bibliography right now with everybody, if I can figure out how to do so. This is a bibliography of sources that I use to put this together, and a lot of which are really helpful for either discovering how to combat stigma or just practical resources and so forth. So let's move into the really practical part now, the solutions, the what can people do, what can institutions do, what cultural changes do we want to see, and then just what are like simple practical steps that people can do, that teachers can do to care for our students, that faculty can do to care for each other, that any peers and any level of education and academia can do to care for each other. And I would love to invite the audience here to just send in their suggestions too. Just what are things that we can do to care for each other individually and institutionally? So who wants to start? I'm still trying to figure out how to share this handout, so go for it.
If you want to text it to me and I can put it up, if it stymies you, I'll be happy to.
Thank you.
One of the practical tips is compared to systemic and policy changes. I'm so excited to hear about what Baylor is doing. One of the practical things I have learned, and I'm going to do that, is if you want to help someone, don't pussyfoot. Even if you're at the level of worried that your advisee or your colleague or your student is suicidal, say the word. Are you thinking of killing yourself? In as normal a tone of voice as possible, so that this person knows you're not going to freak. Even if they're not thinking about it, they hear how non-anxious you are. And it actually takes practicing. Are you worried that you might hurt yourself? Are you thinking about suicide? Hard words to say because our lizard brain fights to survive, and we try not to even think it. But the person who's already there, and you're not going to introduce an idea they've never heard of.
Right. That's research says that. If they haven't thought of it, you're not going to make them think of it.
You're not going to make them think of it. But the fact that you can ask it as a matter-of-fact question like, yeah, people sometimes have this concern. We can talk about it. I can help you find a resource. Shall we get lunch? It's that non-anxious acceptance that can help someone you're talking to say, yeah, I'm thinking about that. And then step for help. That is the second wonderful thing that I learned at that great symposium.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yep. And in a brick and mortar institution, I know that the majority of my colleagues and I have at one time or another walked a student to the counseling center. So making a student aware of resources. So yeah, asking the question. And if they say, yes, I have thought of this, I have thoughts of harming myself or someone else, physically walk them to the resources. Before we close today, I want to hear suggestions from everyone about what an online university can do, because I can't walk my student to the counseling center. But what else can we do? Someone suggests here, it's been my experience as a grad student dealing with a mental health issue that one of the most effective things you can do is to find and follow a self-care regimen, medication, eating well, sleep, exercise, meditation, stress management, stigma management, etc. No one will keep this perfectly, but even if followed imperfectly, it provides a healthy foundation to build on. Yeah, that is very, very well written and very clear. Thank you for sharing that. And then this person asks a follow-up question: how can faculty, staff, students help support each other with this? Yeah, Karen, any professional suggestions there?
Oh, well, okay, firstly, I agree that having a regimen is super, super important, and it can be a very, very simple regimen, whether it is, I'm going to get up, I'm going to eat 3 meals today. I'm going to study at this coffee shop at this time. It can be a structure, any sort of structure that even though you don't have time for something like a long walk or whatever, it provides that structure to get you through the day, because statistically, when people don't have structure in their day and don't have something to plan towards, then they will suffer. So I think the importance of taking the medication, making sure that you're following up with your psychiatrist, and just being aware of how you're feeling in the midst of what you're doing is a good way. And then, sorry, what was the second question again?
Well, could I be annoying and push back on that one first for just a minute?
Yeah.
Because I think the problem there, Karen, is that when one is in a major depressive bout, one cannot do those things. Right? I mean, it's easy for me today to say, I'm going to get up, I'm going to do my yoga, I'm going to eat my salad. But someone who's in a major depressive bout simply, sometimes cannot get out of bed, cannot brush their teeth. And other mental health issues, they tell lies, but they take over the whole consciousness of this, that there's no other self there to combat the lying self.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's definitely, it's definitely hard when you're in that stage. When you're in a stage where your mind isn't thinking clearly because of the depression, you can't think clearly to be like, okay, I need to have this structure. So it can be a really, really big rut. And I think if it gets to that point, like there's a lot of issues to look at. I mean, are the medications working? Like, are they seeing a counselor? Do they see a psychiatrist? Because clearly, if it's the point of someone not being able to physically get out of bed in the morning, then that implies that they're affected in so many ways: nutrition, exercise, likely their academics as well. So it can get into a rut though, because the tendency is to isolate and not reach out for help.
Yeah.
So, and on that level, it's hard to really give a concrete answer. But I do think that, as Sparrow said, for the ones who are a little bit more mentally able out there, feeling a little bit stronger, it's good to be aware of the symptoms of other people struggling. So this person that might not get out of bed in the morning, someone might see them bringing in whatever documents they need to bring in, and that might have been their one outing that day. But someone else might recognize in them that they're really like disheveled. They don't look like they've showered. Like they look like a mess. And that's, I think, where those people, they really have lost any voice to speak for themselves. So it's good to be aware of those kind of symptoms, especially when it's not consistent with how you know that they usually are. If you've known them when they're better, and then you're seeing this a change in their appearance or presentation, can indicate that the person is struggling. And so I think that you know, if a person recognizes that, it's really good to sort of ask them about it. It's one of those questions that doesn't necessarily have an answer.
That's
But
really
I would,
good though, Karen, and that goes to what our previous questioner was saying. How can we support each other? And I think getting training is very, very helpful. So faculty need training for how to recognize those things that you're saying, changes in behavior, right? Maybe departmental trainings, whole grad school trainings for what to look for and how to support each other be really useful. Carl, thoughts on what we can do to either change the culture or support each other?
Yeah, just to jump in there on the question of mental illness, like as you're saying, it's good to have these things to hang on to, but what if you can't get out of bed? A couple of things I'd interject there is the importance of having a handful of friends or family that you're relatively transparent with about your depression, because at that point, when you're having trouble getting out of bed, you probably are not going to be able to autonomously go to the doctor and get checked out. You're going to say to yourself, it's no use anyway, I'm going to stay in bed. And at that point, you need friends or family who will, in extreme cases, even physically take you to the doctor and say, this is what you need to do. So I would emphasize the importance of, one doesn't have to tell everybody everything, but having a handful of people you trust to sort of give you feedback when you are going through these things. So that's one thing I would mention. The other thing is struggling with the difficulty of what you can and can't do. I mean, it's there's degrees of these things. So there's sometimes when I can do a lot, and other times when I'm just sort of utterly depressed and collapsed. And I think about it in terms of I guess using the good times to plan for what I'm going to do when things are bad. So it's sort of like, when I get to, if we think of like the things I'm doing as climbing a ladder, at the good times, I can get up to the higher rungs and whatnot. In the bad times, I may just have trouble getting to the ladder or getting on the first rung. But I think to myself, what is the first thing I can do? And that, it will vary depending on how deep the depression is. But I think, well, I can do something. What is something I can do? And, some days sort of convincing myself to do that one thing will build into being able to do other things. Other times, you only do a few things in a day. But having that sort of plan there, what structure am I going to hang on to when things are really bad, I think can be helpful. And the important thing about that is not to plan more than you can do, is to have a reasonable, like, this is all I can reasonably expect myself to do when I'm depressed, but that is something. So have sort of a doable plan that you come up with when, in the times that you're well, so you can, when you need to hang on to something and everything goes crazy, then you have something solid. So I mean that's something I've sort of developed personally to work with myself, as you know, I'm because I can't just magic away these mental illnesses, but I ask myself, like, how can I sort of cooperate with them to do things? Yeah.
Yeah, we got a comment agreeing with you that supportive peer groups and mentorships are two very important systems for students. So both with the peer-to-peer and the mentor to student, those are both very, very important. And someone else mentions the mental health first aid movement, which is worth looking at along these lines. One person does say here, though, that they feel guilty asking for help. And specifically within academia, I know we have to wrap up soon, but specifically within academia, we always have deadlines, and we always have more than one deadline. So I would say that what you've just described is impossible, Karl, except that your testimony that it isn't. I mean, you successfully achieved the very enormous goal of a PhD, even when there were days that you knew yourself you could just do the one thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, you don't know how many deadlines I'm overdoing right now. You know, I am. I mean, so that is the drawback. Is you have to negotiate that with people, and that's tricky. You know.
Yeah, which is where I think institutional change comes in also, right? That when there are sort of institutional or cultural changes, they can make that more possible for people to have systems to reach out to. Am I frozen here, folks?
No.
I seem to have lost
Okay.
everybody else.
But we can see, yeah.
Hang on, attempting to reconnect.
No, you are fine. Oh, I think you are muted, Serena. While Serena is reconnecting, Karen, I want to know if there is one more thing that you were looking forward to telling us before our time runs out. What is the one most important thing that was on your mind?
That is a very, very broad question.
Oh,
but
okay.
I do think that there is help available, and that's what people, you know, it's hard to see that sometimes, and it's hard. It can be very daunting when we discuss all the barriers and all the difficulties involved in getting help for your mental illness. I think the thing to remember is that there are people out there. There are types of help out there, and you're not alone in struggling with a mental illness. And maybe that's more of a broad statement, but it's quite. I find that it's quite common for one person with mental illness to sort of recognize their own, and so sometimes it's just a matter of sort of identifying other people around you who might be struggling the same way, and then slowly by doing that, it might just make you feel a little bit stronger. And then the other thing I think that Karl brought up is actually really important in terms of making that, what they call it is a relapse prevention plan. So it's kind of like sort of like an advanced directive.
Oh, I like the sound of that. Okay. So it's a plan you make ahead of time.
It's a plan you make ahead of time for someone else to implement in the event that you can't. So you would identify, so like a person might just have a simple piece of paper. They could write down all the phone numbers for the crisis lines, for the helplines, and every line would be different based on location. They could specify to their family member, to their friend, to their loved one, if I start displaying the following symptoms, if I start, you know, if you recognize these behaviors in me, you have permission to take me to emergency, even if I'm kicking and screaming. Sometimes that makes the family members comfortable enough to, sorry, I can't hear you. I think.
Oh no, I'm just talking to myself.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah, so sometimes the family members or the loved ones and stuff, it also empowers them too, because then they have that validation that, okay, even though this person is like wanting to punch me in the face right now, they're gonna thank me later. So it's kind of a plan, and if a person does get to that point where they're able to do a bit more planning, where they're able to get out of bed and do a few things, if they do anything, it's good to have that network of people, and to, even if it's one person that can check in with them and tell them, okay, I noticed this about you. You give them permission to do that, then they don't feel guilty about checking in with you. And you can say, like, ask me about anything. Ask me if I want to harm myself. Ask me, so you can really, really, really make it specific if you just even have one other person to be that person to check in with you. So, yeah.
All right. That is a fabulous idea. I love it. I realize we're running a little bit over time. I want to ask Karl, when you have had your awful days and can only do one thing, if you were going to speak to future Sparrow when I'm having my awful day, what is the one thing you want me to get out of bed and do?
That's a good question, but I think it probably starts with taking care of yourself physically. So if you haven't eaten anything, eat something.
Drink water, eat real food, move.
Yes.
Just keep the system going.
Yeah, because my brain wants to leap right into the academic work and just let everything go. And but I mean, when I'm in that place, I just my body is lacking the energy, and I need to be reminded to take care of that before I can start doing the thinking. I mean, that day I may not get any thinking done. I may just get taken care of the body done.
You may just eat and have water. Good.
Yeah. So I mean, that's sort of what I would say to do first. If you have sort of something else that can be helpful there is if you have like a routine in terms of prayer, or if you do yoga or something, or something like that, where you're something that allows you to step back. I mean, for other people, it might be exercise. For me, it's very hard to get myself to exercise, but it is a proven way of fighting these things. So anything like that maybe lets you step out of your mind and get your body doing something is probably what I would start with.
Fantastic. Serena, welcome back. Before I give you back the floor, I wanted to directly address the person who said, I feel guilty asking for help. And to everyone else who's listening who has thought that. And I think that's everyone who is listening. If I were at a Mythmoot and you ran into me crying into my scrambled eggs, I know you. You would come over and sit and say, Sparrow, what's up? Is this horrible pain, or are the eggs just wrong? You would help me. Help will always be given. If it was me, you would help. So please, guilt is not a good use of your energy. I know it's there. I know it's real. But everyone here talking, everyone else listening to this wants to be of service to the world. This is why we're on fire about learning. This is why we're on fire about our colleagues. Help will always be given. Okay, Serena, I'm going to cry for a second.
That's fine. Well, that's actually perfect, Sparrow, because I was going to say to all of our attendees, we're over time, so if you want to say goodbye, that would be great. But I think some of us may want to share personal stories too. So why don't we say we're at the official end of the symposium. We've been through the statistics, we've been through some solutions. I have other systemic cultural institutional solutions I've come across that we can post somewhere, whatever. But if anybody here on the panel would like to share a more personal story, Karl, you mentioned bringing faith into it. We could frame our discussions from our personal points of view. That would be great. So I'll say goodbye in case anyone's leaving. And I don't know if any of you have to run to collect children or get to class or anything.
That's exactly what I'm typing. Thank you all. It is such a privilege to meet you, Karen, and to sit at the table with all of you. Good night. I have to run and get the teenager.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you, Sparrow. Yeah. So did any Pearsons have more they wanted to say that we haven't been able to get to?
It's such an extensive topic, and there's so many ways that the conversation could go. So it's hard because I could talk for hours and hours about it. So yeah. I think the questions have been pretty focused and have been touching the really main issues. So I think that we're doing pretty good.
Great. Karl, anything else you wanted to share that you didn't think we touched on?
I think maybe the final thing, for those who suffer from these things, one of my frustrations is peppy awareness posters, let's say. These are frustrating to me because a lot of times, we want to sort of culturally and medically treat mental illness like other medical issues. So we want to go to a doctor and take a pill and it'll all be better. Which is true sometimes. For some people, it is simply a matter of balancing something medically in their system or something like that. But very often it's the case that treatment for depression is complicated and often not fully completed. So one of the good comparisons that I've heard it compared to is something like having diabetes, where you get diagnosed with something, but it's not just a matter of popping a pill and there you're all better. It's a matter you have to measure your blood sugar for the rest of your life. You have to change your diet in some ways for this, and that, at least I find in my experience, a more realistic analogy. So often, awareness campaigns, and I realize we do it for a particular reason. They're sort of like, come if you talk to us, you'll get better. That's sort of, the hopeful, and one understands why we do that. It's because one wants to hold out hope, and one wants to not cause people to despair. But my experience is more often the case is you open up and you get help, and some things are fixed and some things are not. So it is, I guess, thinking about mental illness as something that is usually chronic rather than something that is just sort of a single time experience. There are some people for whom that is the case, but I think just from my experience, a deeper understanding of the chronic nature of mental illness would be helpful, and an understanding that one day I might be dealing with things in a very sane way, and the next day I might not. Yeah.
Or as one of our listeners here puts it, for some of us it is for life and no solution. Mm-hmm. It's a managing and functioning rather than curing, mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah, and we need to, because that often sounds scary to people. And it is scary because it's, we're saying we're up against something that we can't always get rid of. But the fact that it's scary means we don't often talk about it, and that sort of leaves out the people who do experience it as a reality they experience throughout their life. So we need to somehow make, it is really a scary thing because, it's the fact that we can't control everything, but we need to talk about that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. All it, I believe, should be seen as, in many cases, a chronic illness, and it's odd that we often don't compare it with other chronic illnesses that might affect us physically. People tend to separate the psychiatric and the physical as if they're two separate parts of the body, but in actuality, they're very, very connected. And when you look at someone with a chronic illness, say they have fibromyalgia, and it's something that is with them for the rest of their life, often the treatment is checking with their doctor, but also a lot of support groups, a lot of programs designed to help them cope through something than rather finish something, or rather get over something. So the programs are very designed and focused on navigating your way through it with no end in sight necessarily. However, it makes you stronger as you navigate your way through it, and you find supports with other people who have fibromyalgia. And I think the same can be said for depression. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or as our listener here says, you try to assimilate it into your life. Another question here, and probably specifically for you, Karl, does your academic work ever help, and or do you ever write your illness into your academic work? So are those two things ever integrated for you?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I would say, I'd say overall, yes, this kinds of subjects I study often have to do with literary and theological ways of dealing with suffering. You know, which is kind of you know, a direct result of you know, having to live with this. So I do sort of choose my topics around that interest, and I do try to in some of my more creative writing to bring the two together. It's incredibly difficult because they're really two different modes of writing. The academic mode, you're sort of using evidence to prove facts, and the creative mode, you are, you know, sort of more reflecting on your emotions and the place of suffering in one's world. But I try to blend the two. Maybe because I am kind of searching for that pre-Enlightenment understanding of the self. You know, we after the Enlightenment and after Romanticism, we've kind of cordoned these things off. We have the intellect on one side and the sort of creative mode on the other side. And so, I mean, in what I consider the best of my writing, I'm looking for a wholeness that you know, was lost, and that perhaps I can find. So it is fair to say that it does influence my work a lot, and finds its way into my work. I'm pretty sure when there was one point when I was seeing a psychiatrist, and I told him what I was doing my dissertation on, and I'm pretty sure that he thought, you know, your dissertation is just a big neurosis, you know, because it, you know, it had to do so much with the kinds of things, you know, I was going through with depression and whatnot. So yeah, there is a close connection. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily always see it if you didn't know me, but if you know me, you know, it comes out.
I thought you were going to say he'd said the opposite, that you're obviously writing your dissertation as therapy, that it's, you know, that you're dealing.
Well, he was very silent. That's how I interpreted his silence. You know, but
okay, I see. Yeah. Well, I want to give a plug for literature on the other end too, though, because you work on pre-modern literature, and that idea of holism, of the whole person, is there. But I see some modernists striving to reclaim that. And I work on people who were deeply immersed in the occult revival from 1890 to 1945 in the British Isles. And I think one of the reasons that the occult suddenly became so popular again was this desire for holism. And sort of institutionalized religion largely affected by the Enlightenment and by some particular aspects of modernity and a rationalist approach and an almost Gnostic separation of the spirit and the body. I think people were looking for a more holistic spirituality in these alternative routes. And they were trying to reunite the body and the mind through ritual, so through embodied practices. And then, of course, the authors that we tend to love the most here at Signum were also looking at a holistic way of using imagination as a route to follow to reunite the whole person. There's a lot of healing to be found in the literature that we love and study.
Yeah.
Well, and on that note, what do you think? Shall we wrap up?
I think that's probably a good place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any final questions from any of our audience? All right. This talk will eventually be posted on YouTube, and I will try to find somewhere to post the bibliography, since I wasn't able to send that out, and maybe some other thoughts as well. I think it'd be great if we had a discussion forum or some kind of a support venue or something. So maybe I'll brainstorm that with our digital campus people. All right. Well, thank you again, Karen. Thank you, Karl. Karl, it's good to see you again. Maybe we can have another chat one of these days.
Yeah, that would be good. And thank you for chairing. You've done an excellent job of.
Yeah, thanks for continuing there when my internet went out. Thank you to our attendees, and do share the recording with your friends when it comes out if you think it was helpful. Okay, goodbye all.
Goodbye.
Bye.